Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Many thanks for joining us on this last day of Lausanne VII. My name is Lydia Lanman, and I'm the Senior Global Access Policy Leader at Roche. I lead our global policy efforts in Alzheimer's disease, and I'll be moderating today's panel. So far, we've heard some discussions about the transforming landscape of Alzheimer's due to the current pandemic that we're living in, the attention needed on innovation, and importantly, how to scale and link these through global collaboration. Today's focus will be about how we can support access to new AD innovations, and as we've just heard from the previous panel, investing in innovation will be necessary to help address a significant socioeconomic impact of Alzheimer's disease. In that end, this panel will focus on how to better develop the evidence to support access to future innovations, including through value assessment. I'd like to note that I'm also here representing PAVE, Project Alzheimer's Value Europe, a forum funded by Roche, Biogen, and the Global COI that has been established to create a collaborative multi-stakeholder platform focused on the value assessment of and reimbursement and funding for emerging therapies and diagnostic innovations in AD in Europe. Today, several of our panelists are members of PAVE, and we want to have a discussion on what the most important elements of value must be considered when looking at new AD innovations and what actions can be taken to improve the evidence available to support the value assessment of and access to innovations for Alzheimer's disease. Before we get started, I'd like to ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. I'd like to start with Sam Benham-Hermetz, Director of Policy and Public Affairs at ARUK. Sam, to you.
Hello, I'm Sam Benham-Hermetz, Director of Policy and Public Affairs at Alzheimer's Research UK, and we've been looking at what matters most to people affected by Alzheimer's disease and dementia and their caregivers to make sure that we are incorporating people's own preferences in our work to ensure that value assessment captures what really matters most. Now I'll hand over to Annie to introduce herself.
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Annie Chicoye. I'm a health economist and I'm lecturing at Sciences Po Paris. My point is that given the long-term issues related to Alzheimer's disease, I think that we should consider to have more flexibility in the frameworks by which HTA bodies across Europe may assess the value. And I think there is room for discussion on a certain number of topics like comorbidities, like caregivers' impact. We need to adjust the frameworks for this disease, and there is room for discussion. I pass it to Anders, sorry.
Hi, thank you, Annie. Hello, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. My name is Anders Gustavsson, and I'm a health economist. I work at the company called Quantify, based in Stockholm. I'm interested in Alzheimer's disease since 15 years. I've been working a lot on value demonstration of the drugs that are candidates for being for treatment, both symptomatic and disease modifying. I'd like to push for the sort of comprehensiveness of this problem and the need for a societal perspective that we have heard from other discussions today, but also a long-term perspective and the need to go beyond the clinical trial and the need to have real-world evidence and economic decision analytic models to evaluate new drugs coming. So here we need a lot of collaboration to get data, good outcomes, so that we can properly evaluate these new treatments. I'm handing over to Debra.
Well, thank you, Anders. Thank you, everyone. I'm Deborah Lapin. I've had the privilege of working with George Vredenberg, Against Alzheimer's now for 10 years as a senior strategy advisor. I'm a principal in a large law firm, Faegre, Drinker, Biddle. And I come to you today as leading with Russ Paulson what we call AD PACE, the Alzheimer's Disease Patient and Caregiver Engagement Initiative, where we too, as our friends in ARUK, are looking at what matters most to patients and bringing a new level of evidence and data forward, especially now in the United States, as we're looking at the first value assessment of a drug, a disease-modifying therapy. And we'll talk to you today about how I think there's an amazing convergence where we have the chance to bring advocacy and evidence together to truly, collectively here be a vector for change.
Great, thanks, Deborah. And thank you all for your introductions. I'd really like us to get started on today's discussion. So in the previous session, we heard a lot from the panelists around the various aspects of value in assessing AD, as well as some of the significant challenges in dealing with complex and dispersed evidence in value assessment. Today, I'd really like to start our discussion to explore kind of your various perspectives on what you think the most important element of value is to be considered in Alzheimer's disease, and how we actually may go about getting the evidence needed to support value assessment for new innovations in AD. Sam, happy to start with you again.
So we're doing a piece of work to really understand from people with their own experience of Alzheimer's disease and dementia what really matters most. So I think the starting point has to be people affected by Alzheimer's disease and dementia. We have to ask them what the challenges are and what could be overcome. We've done some initial work with the University of Edinburgh to understand this, and people talk to us about, obviously, the important role of managing symptoms, the importance of being able to ensure that the activities of daily living, people are able to continue with their independence and restore their sense of identity. These are the things that people really value, and what we want to see is these being incorporated more effectively into how we regulate and how we assess value in access to future treatments.
Thanks, Sam. And Annie, what are your thoughts on this in terms of the most important element of value and how we actually get the evidence to address it?
I think we don't have yet the total evidence because we still lack the framework to assemble that. I think that there is a lot of work to do around early stages, because this is where minimum improvement can be difficult to capture, and this is probably the challenge. But when the disease goes on, we also need to have a more systemic, I would say, approach, because the directly related expression of the disease are not sufficient, in my opinion, to really capture the whole impact. This is why I think that we have to take into account, especially from a payer's perspective, which is the one I might adopt, to have the full vision of what's going on with this patient. And this is why I mentioned comorbidities. I know it's not directly related to the disease, but we know that people with mental diseases have comorbidities in excess. And I think that the more we can show first by modeling and then in real-world evidence, and I think Anders will have a lot to say about that, the more we can make the claim about the value of this systemic impact on the patient. And a little bit in the same approach, I would mention the issue with caregivers. So I think we are not we don't have the appropriate framework in a number of countries to have this systemic perception of where the value lies with patients, and there is a lot of work to do yet on this respect.
Great, thanks, Annie. And Anders, would love to know your thoughts, particularly given you and your team's background in doing a lot of modeling and epi work.
Thanks, and I like Annie's perspective on this, and I really also agree that we need a better understanding of the different kinds of patients that we are dealing with here, and better data on the natural progression of the disease, how patients are identified, how they differ from each other. I think there are so many studies and so many different cohorts that show different types of outcomes and also different estimates of these outcomes, potentially outcomes that should be similar across cohorts, but they aren't. There's a lot of variation. So I think sort of my key ambition would be to make better data more easy to access. That could be by better agreement on what outcomes should be collected, also how data should be collected, how patients are how patient cohorts are described in different studies and cohorts, and sort of having an agreement on a uniform data set or core outcome set and the combination of those to sort of set up a better infrastructure on how to get these data from clinical practice on real patients outside clinical trial, so that we understand the sort of the complexity of this. Not only that it is complexity, but also have a better picture of the comprehensiveness of this.
Yeah, thanks, Anders. And your comments around trying to understand the kind of the clinical particularities across the disease states is really important. And Debra, I'd like your perspective, just kind of going from that, particularly as we talk about kind of, what's mattering to patients and how can, we develop this evidence set to support value assessment. Would love some of your thoughts.
Well, thank you, because it is about evidence. It's about advocacy and evidence, but advocacy without the evidence is emotion. And we're ready to do something more than mere emotion and deliver this evidence. And especially this morning, we've heard about a remarkable collective that can bring this evidence base so that value assessors face a compelling, unavoidable demand to bring this kind of evidence forward. And I'll talk about that. In our AD PACE work, Us Against Alzheimer's has brought together in a pre-competitive consortium with ultimately 6 drug companies, FDA, CMS, CDC, and NIH, and patient and caregiver voices to design a 2-year study that has looked at, first qualitatively, what matters. And we together in the study, together with a literature search, identify what we hope could become a standard of 42 concepts of interest, reduced from a massive number brought down by RTI, our great collaborator in this, to 42 ways that at a point of saturation, patients and caregivers have identified things that matter. Then in the quantitative phase of the study, we took the same groups, which, and this is very important for later points I will make, pre-symptomatic with underlying AD pathology confirmed by a diagnosis, but pre-symptomatic with any tests we use today to measure cognition or function. Mild MCI, mild AD, all of those we assumed we could have direct interactions with the individual. Caregivers with moderate and caregivers with severe AD. In the quantitative phase, we looked at how do these individuals cross-sectionally across 5 different parts of the continuum of severity value those 42 items. What came to the top? What did they put at the bottom? And there were many surprises in this quantitative phase. The first and obvious one was that the people with mild AD many of them required a caregiver to engage. Secondly, the first 3 categories, pre-symptomatic and MCI, reported changes in their function, changes in their cognition, and reported the same value assessments as those with more, with mild AD. So we saw very early on that people were experiencing changes, and this is consistent with what we heard in the opening today by the study by Lily and by Doreen Rintz and by David Bloom and others. So we are beginning to get this quantitative, rigorous evidence base that says you cannot ignore this. Something's happening, and these individuals can tell you what they value. So what did people value? And what we heard was in the very early stages of disease, people valued the need for emotional well-being, not to become agitated, not to become depressed, the sense of self. So the question is, are we measuring those things? Because if a drug delivers those things, we know that the true beholder of value is the patient and the caregiver. That drug is delivering value. So the next part of this study, and I'll stop, but I'll come back to more detail because I think it's going to be so relevant here. But the next part of our study, and we're ready and going to be reporting these data early next year, is to take the current outcome assessments we use today in trials, 20 of them. They're familiar to everybody here, but they're what we use to measure measurable clinical effect, and we're mapping those to what patients and caregivers are telling us is clinically meaningful effect, and seeing if there's a correlation. And this is terribly important. Because if a value assessor wants to hide behind a fact that, oh, there was only a modest change in a measure that we used in the clinical trial, is that sufficient evidence, which we have been told they were initially thinking of doing? We need to show, no, that modest effect is mapped to something that's very meaningful to a patient. Mm-hmm. You cannot ignore that modest effect. This drug has real impact. So I think patients have to be the leaders, patient organizations, in driving this new kind of data delivery to our healthcare and tech and assessors of value globally.
Great. Thanks a lot, Debra. And Sam, Debra really raised some good points that I'd like you to kind of weigh in on. So she talked about the need for, evidence, particularly patient level and caregiver evidence. But how can we kind of better understand and incorporate these preferences and value within value assessment?
Absolutely. I think certainly in many countries, but certainly in the UK, the assessment of value often takes into account very narrow perspectives. So as Anders described, purely the results of a clinical trial. In some cases, patient-reported outcome measures, but these aren't thoroughly incorporated and given equal weighting to other outcomes. And I think that's something that we would like to see change. So thinking, for example, around the role of what patients value, what people affected by Alzheimer's disease and dementia report as being most impactful. We know that some health technology assessors simply don't take into account those outcome measures at all, or those preferences. And similarly, we also know that, for example, there's a very narrow definition, certainly in the UK system, around carers' health-related quality of life. So some of those wider societal values, as we discussed this morning, simply aren't included. We also know there's a very narrow definition of quality of life. So often EQ5D is used as the measure of all things, when actually, it particularly in Alzheimer's disease and dementia, it isn't an appropriate proxy in many cases. So what we want to see is more flexibility, is different ways of doing things. And I think when you think about the role of digital tech, the emergence of data as a huge resource and how that's disrupted many other industries, I think healthcare is ripe for actually collecting a wider range of data. Interesting, I was talking to a carer recently about the sense of having been involved in health technology appraisals and having to give their own perspective on that burden that they had experienced. And, they said, oh, well, we'd only been to 4 hospital appointments this year. And actually, when she looked back at her diary, it was more like 20. But so in terms of the experience of caregiving, sometimes, so I suppose what I'm saying is, could there be more appropriate passive tools or other ways to collect that accurate data that helps us to then quantify the value of different interventions? And I think really finding ways to involve both people affected by Alzheimer's disease and dementia and their caregivers more appropriately in those value assessments surely has to be the way forward.
And you noted that there's some challenges we've seen in terms of whether or not in value assessment these elements of value are considered or given weight, as well as what kind of data is accepted by HTA bodies. I know that AR UK has done quite a bit of work directly with NICE. Where do you see maybe some of the opportunities to maybe shift that thinking of HTA bodies to put a greater weight and to truly consider some of these patient and caregiver preferences?
I do think that, so we've been involved in NICE's methods review this summer. So they have been looking at how they assess value, particularly around managing uncertainty, all things that I'm sure around the world we're grappling with. And, that particularly are of concern and of interest to Alzheimer's disease and new disease-modifying treatments. One of the challenges is, well, from our perspective, is ensuring that those value assessments keep pace with the progress that we're seeing in terms of science, medical developments and breakthroughs in terms of drug discovery, we need to ensure that the health technology assessors are ensuring that they keep the flexibility within the system, that we're looking at the widest possible range of evidence. And I think that as Anders was saying, the opportunity to incorporate real-world evidence is a real advantage. So, for example, in the UK, what we've seen is where we have the Cancer Drugs Fund, which essentially allows companies to strike managed access agreements to make drugs available and collect real-world evidence from people affected by cancer, we have seen faster approvals of new treatments. And obviously that is what we all hope for Alzheimer's disease too. So partly it is the role of health technology assessors, but it's also the role for new interventions and new schemes that allow us to collect better data and ensure that those can be appropriately used to assess value.
Great. Thanks a lot, Sam. And, I think this is an important piece, but I think also one of the limitations that we found, particularly in AD and what was mentioned in the previous panel, is just somewhat a lack of understanding about the natural history of the disease itself. And so I know that, Anders, you have been doing some work for PAVE, building out an epidemiology model. And so I'd love to maybe share some of that with the audience here. And really, why is this kind of work necessary when we're talking about kind of value and assessing value?
Yeah, it's really exciting work and really important, as you say. I think we often hear this 5 million people with dementia estimate globally, but we don't really have an understanding of what is the size of the population that's actually eligible for these target treatments that are being developed right now. Surely it's not 5 million. It's some other figure that we are targeting, but we don't have a good idea on the size of that. And I think also with there are so many subgroups and stages within the Alzheimer's disease spectrum, and the duration within those stages that we need to get a better handle on. And what we're doing now is to simply review the evidence that's available and see if we can get to some better understanding of both the sizes of the different populations that are of relevance for treatment, and also the duration of the stages.
And Anders, we'd love to hear back, because I think you have assembled a pretty impressive group of clinicians and experts across Europe on the steering committee. What have been, I guess, some of their feedback early in terms of this work and maybe some of the challenges that will need to be overcome when building out an EPI model?
Yeah, it is, again, the sort of both wealth of data and also scarcity of data. I think in terms of Alzheimer's disease, it's a lot of the biomarkers and the etiology of their symptoms, and differences over time or the diagnostic criteria are changing over time. So a lot of the old good studies, they are maybe not as applicable right now, and as we learn more about the etiology of the disease. So I think at the same time there's a lot of evidence, but there are so many differences and variations across them. So it's difficult to do, for instance, a meta-analysis on the available evidence to get to a reasonable estimate. So I think we need to find our way in the jungle.
Yeah, the feast and famine of EPI work, which we've kind of learned over the last number of months, and probably you've been well aware over the last decade. I guess the last piece I just wanted to kind of think about, really related to your previous comments, is around, how does this kind of EPI work, which is kind of looking at natural history of disease and trying to predict, how patients move from one, disease state to the next. How does this kind of maybe complement some real world evidence, right? Which is really looking at people with dementia or, with MCI once they are on therapy, and, how they, again, then potentially move through stages of disease. How do you marry kind of EPI work and then real world data collection?
I think it's really important to have a really specific description of your cohort when you start to look at what is the value of treating this cohort, so that you have a good understanding of who patients are and how many they are and how they are defined and identified in your setting. I mean, it's the context that you are introducing your treatment. So I think it's really important that you have a good idea on who they are, simply. And this is the foundation for that, to understand their definition and their prevalence.
Great, thanks. And, I want to circle back to you, Debra, and really kind of, I guess, linking back from the comments of Anders, in that there's a lot of data and sometimes not enough data. And I think there were some comments in the previous panel around ICER in the US and them taking on the examination of the value assessment for aducanumab. How has Us Against Alzheimer's been engaged in this process and really maybe tackling those questions around a lot of evidence and a lack of evidence, and which ones to kind of focus on?
I think you learn in the policy world that you're never in control of timing. So yes, would it be better if ICER did this 8 months from now? But they aren't. They're doing it now. And it's a fast-paced undertaking that with the leadership of Russ Paulson, our new COO, he's been here a year, we have engaged with ICER from the inception to say, you decided to do this, and all eyes are going to be on you. This is different. You've never done anything like this before. Don't think you have a model for tackling the value of an intervention in Alzheimer's. And we're going to help you try to get this right. And if I have a call to action today, is that we have the opportunity for a real collaboration, as I said, to be in front of them and to be forceful with as much evidence as we have, or the evidence that they need to develop. But what we have done is this. We've engaged now at every point, first with the opportunity to comment on what their review should look like. Then the second opportunity was to comment on their draft evidence framework. And now they've responded to those comments. And I wanted to just share with you 3 areas, Lydia, and the group here today, of input that we've given and how ICER preliminarily is responding to this. So 3 key points that we are driving hard into this process. The first is that there are 2 patients. There is, and Meryl Comer and others have been saying this for years. We have the patient themselves, we have the caregiver, and impacts on the caregiver and what those save or can prevent in terms of societal costs, health system costs, unpaid care is something that has to be considered. Second, ICER is using as a comparative, initially, best supportive care. Well, we and others said, who knows what that even is? So they modified that to supportive care. And so we're saying to them, supportive care has to include the societal costs of unpaid informal care. Mm-hmm. You cannot use the word supportive care in Alzheimer's without bringing in these unpaid costs. So we've used the evidence that's available, and we're going to use more evidence. And I'm so grateful for the work that David Bloom is doing with the Global Alzheimer's Platform, or with the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, because the more we can get the evidence on the cost of unpaid care, we presented that it's $28,000 a year, the same per patient, the same cost as paid care. David this morning says $230 million a year annually. Whatever these data are, we're going to bring them forward and say these must be part of how you compute supportive care as the comparator for aducanumab plus supportive care. And finally, we've insisted that they look at the health disparity and impacts of this disease on populations of color and on women and on underserved populations. How did they respond? And this is really important. And I want to be very clear, we think this is significant that they have included the caregiver impacts, not as contextual, but as part of the code-based case analysis. And this was a revision they made. What do they take into consideration in caregiver impact? They take into quality of life of the caregiver, the health of the caregiver, and the caregiver's productivity. we as a group must hold them accountable to this and help them find the evidence base for those costs. Second, they've asked to collaborate with us on what they call patient important outcomes. So we're going to deliver in the pre-publication data package of all of this work for 2 years to them under a CDA so they can see it all. And again, we'll hold them accountable that you're seeing real evidence here. We want you to reflect it in your study. And finally, they have noted in the contextual considerations that disadvantaged and underserved populations are going to be included. So I think that there are several firsts here. The proof will be in the pudding. And the more we can collaborate, I think, as I've said now twice or 3 times, to be both advocates and evidence generators during this really critical process that will have global impacts. I mean, this is going to have impacts that will have signals and circles that will expand out, we think, long after whenever they render this report in May. So I'll stop there, Lydia.
No, that's really great, Deborah. And the one piece I really wanted to kind of highlight and perhaps get Annie's reflections on is this collaboration between, HTA bodies, ICER, different kind of groups that are involved in value assessment and payers, along with innovators or manufacturers, those groups that are actually trialing these drugs. So Annie, from kind of your experience and your background, kind of from the payer and HTA perspective, how do you think, and I guess how and when do you think this collaboration should be happening? I'm assuming it probably should be happening a lot earlier than it currently is. So would love some of your thoughts and maybe some ideas on how we can kind of look for the future and how we can work more closely together.
Yes, I think what you described, Debra, with the ICR is a very good approach, and it seems that it does get through because it's the patient representative who are putting that on the table with this assessment process. I think we should be consistent with HTA bodies to be ready, to be more flexible. And Sam, you really mentioned these words, flexible. Yes, we need flexibility. I think that our HTA bodies at large are very much influenced by the work they've been doing on oncology, which has been so important in volume to start with, because so much innovation, and that the sort of rigidity they've developed in this area, not rigidity because they turn out to be innovative when true innovation comes up. But we need to enlarge their vision, and I think that AD is really the extreme topic. Because it lasts long, because it combines mental disease, behavior, and functional handicap for a long time in elderly patients, and because the caregivers are elderly as well. I think we should push, more flexibility into the systems. And we need to have a pre-competitive forum somehow, at least on European basis. I just wonder whether there could be an initiative, because we have early dialogues, we have this kind of approach with HTA bodies, but they are not pre-competitive, they are specific, and they are not published. I mean, it's not the area to discuss, really. It's not sufficient. And I just wonder whether there would be, we need an institutional umbrella, to create a forum that would really take the HTA to be ready to adapt their framework. And you have the problem in the UK. I mean, it's true. It's a framework. It's really a little bit different in Sweden, but I think we need somewhere to have an institutional umbrella, maybe the European Commission may be open to that because, there is a lot of interest given, I think, to health, especially with the COVID-19, which really reminds people that health is important, and create some sort of forum that could be very, very helpful with a major role to be played by patient associations. And we can hear you, and fed with all the work that you are doing, Anders, and some groups are doing on the field, gathering evidence and gaps of evidence, and work on a consensual approach somehow. I think there is room for that. I think that probably PAVE may push on that. I don't know which organization can do, but there is certainly room for that, and we are not yet there. I mean, we have to make it pushy right now.
And you raise a kind of a good, where can we kind of have a forum or, something that is kind of maybe agnostic, that where we can kind of discuss these issues and get some, I guess, alignment. Are there any, I guess, examples? I think you touched briefly on Sweden that could maybe use to kind of as a best practice, that we could expand kind of the thinking beyond just an individual country and look for something that's a bit broader.
My perception is that Sweden has the appropriate approach. Maybe you may not be in agreement with that, because first, very important is that Sweden have a societal perspective from the very start, and it makes a difference. It makes a difference even when you evaluate, you assess migraine treatments, for instance. It does make a difference when you have a societal perspective, and I think this is one of the limitations we have in a number of countries. ICR was limited in that, but NICE is limited. The French system is limited. I think there is probably a benchmark, interesting benchmark to do with the Swedish approach. I'm not, we would need some expertise about this system. And again, also there is we are stuck against this very demanding requirement of methodological soundness. We can but agree that you need to have robust evidence, well supported with good tools, validated tools, etc., to inform a decision. But when you are in a disease where there is limited tools, where there is this very subtle impact to capture, you can be open to work with tools that you can validate a long time. You can validate through post-launch assessments with real-world evidence, etc. I think flexibility is something that we really need, because it's an extreme disease in the scope of the disease usually assessed through the system, because we had no new product for a long time, and we shall have very significantly innovative product in the way they address very specific stages we have not addressed before. When we're talking about, prodromal stage, for instance.
No, thank you, Annie. Were there any, I guess, comments to Annie, Anders, maybe on whether or not you agree on the openness or the flexibility that we see in Sweden?
Yeah, well, now also with the COVID situation, there's a lot of debate of obviously also, or especially within elderly care, in our elderly care homes, which have been really impacted by COVID. And I think we have a lot of improvements to do in Sweden also. We can probably learn from each other, a lot of countries. And also we have the reputation of having a societal perspective all the time, but we're partly moving away from that also because of equity reasons, that when you include indirect costs, there's sort of an inherent problem with that in those that actually are not working, and that their time is valued less and so forth. So I think the key here is that we can learn jointly. And I was involved in the IMI roadmap project a couple of years ago, and I think it was a great experience seeing different representatives from HA bodies and others sort of convening and discussing these issues in a pre-competitive manner from their perspective, and sort of getting a joint understanding of the complexity in this, and how you can reason in different countries on how to face these challenges. So I'd like to see more of that, where different reimbursement and HA bodies, and I mean, this is on a policy level also, that we need our policymakers to actually tell them to have a societal perspective. They can't just start doing that by their own initiative, right? So I like the idea of having this discussion in the European Commission and also on the national level to push for a societal perspective. And I think not least the COVID situation shows that we can't look at silos and do sort of a partial analysis of a complex area like this, but there are so many parts of society that is affected and dependent on others, and we have really learned that the hard lesson in Sweden this last year.
So we have a very short amount of time, but we have a really good question I'd like to talk about, probably get everyone to weigh in on. And so we've, I think, spent a lot of time talking about what's needed, what evidence is needed for the value assessment to really pave the way towards access to disease-modifying therapies. But I think where we've actually seen a lot of innovation in the AD space is around detection and diagnosis, particularly with biomarkers. So this question comes from our friend Dennis Horgan at the European Alliance for Personalized Medicine. Taking into account different healthcare systems, are there any good examples of an evidence framework to support bringing biomarker testing into healthcare systems so that value is recognized? And so this value of ensuring kind of early detection and diagnosis, particularly with the use of advanced biomarkers. The EAPM put out a recent paper, so I think that is probably the question behind Dennis's question. So Sam, if you have a response or a perspective on this, I'd love to hear from you.
So I think there's huge excitement and optimism about the role of biomarkers, and particularly in driving forward improvements in diagnostics. Certainly in the UK, it does feel as though there haven't been those advances, or certainly there is certainly some resistance. So I mean, I'm sure you'll all have heard this, but we often get told by decision makers within the NHS that there's no point investing in diagnostics until we have a DMT. And obviously, you know, it completely rides roughshod over a patient's right to know, over the need for earlier and accurate diagnosis, and really the difference that makes. And certainly we heard about it yesterday in context of clinical trials, both a clinical nihilism and also nihilism from patients of not, you know, seeing the point of being involved in clinical research. And I think I'd just like to contrast that to oncology, you know, where you do see metastatic patients in cancer seeing clinical trials as an opportunity for life-extending treatments, the most innovative opportunities. And I think actually diagnostics herald the opportunity for that. But unfortunately, in terms of the UK context, I don't believe that the current appraisal system is open to that. But I think that the advent of, for example, blood-based biomarkers, which would be so much cheaper than current diagnostic tools, could herald such an opportunity to really be a game changer in this field.
Yeah, I think particularly from kind of a health system capacity perspective, I know Soren Matke, who sat on a panel yesterday, did some work that was published earlier this year around the benefit actually combining an MMSE and a blood-based biomarker earlier on has, just from a very pure kind of like cost effectiveness model, but as well as from a health system capacity model. So that might be a good piece to maybe kind of start that conversation. Debra, did you have any kind of perspectives from your side, particular, I think, related to what Sam's comments were around this maybe public nihilism? Why would I get a diagnosis?
I think we have to believe that there is going to be a disease-modifying therapy soon. And it could be conditional on a phase 4 trial. And we have a real obligation in the patient community to think about this real world evidence platform that serves agnostically all phases of the disease, so DMTs, but also symptomatic drugs that maybe address agitation, address psychosis. These drugs are in the pipeline. But anticipating that there could be and will be a disease-modifying therapy for early disease requires that we also anticipate a public that we hope will begin to change overnight from nihilism to, oh my gosh, could this help me? And we want to anticipate that. Us Against Alzheimer's has a Be Brain Powerful campaign that, people are willing to talk about their brain health in a way that they're very afraid of talking about the stigma of Alzheimer's. So will we see, and next year in Lausanne, when we're all together personally, will we see a very different landscape where the public is ready to come to a new conversation about their brain health and is hopeful? And imagine that being coupled with the blood-based biomarker. The change in our world, we have to be thinking forward to what next year and the next 2 years could look like. So we as the patient groups are organized and ready to meet this new consumer and bring them into earlier detection and diagnosis.
Great. So we are almost at the end of our panel. I feel like we've just scratched the surface. So we will continue this discussion at PAVE. But as we end off, I just wanted to offer the folks, both for ourselves as well as everyone kind of watching this, very quickly, what's the call to action? What's the thing that you can do today or tomorrow to kind of get us there, or to leave the panelists? What can we do? So first, Anders will start, and then to Annie, and then we'll close off with Sam and Debra.
I'm coming back to where I started with making data access easier. So I think this is on a policy level. I think we need to have the discussion on data integrity and how to remove the legal and technical barriers to data.
Super, thanks, Anders. Annie.
I think there is a need to project what is AD again versus the present crisis, of course, and versus oncology. I don't mean against, but I need in comparison, because I think that it's not necessarily a very high topic in the mind of decision makers so far, and I think this should be reactivated in some sort of a way, and probably a forum somehow would be important, at least in the European situation right now.
Awesome. Thanks, Annie. Debra, and then Sam.
Back to what I said, I think we have the chance to bring a pre-competitive collaborative together so that we don't lose the opportunity and time that we've been given, and to create the best, not the perfect evidence base, and bring it to health assessors, and in particular ICER, so that these kinds of flexibility and data on the real costs, the societal impact of this disease is something they can't avoid.
Super. And Sam, you get the last word here.
Well, so I wanted to give the last word to people affected by Alzheimer's disease, and just really my call to action is around, in all of our work, whoever we are, whatever we do, to make sure that we're meaningfully involving people affected by Alzheimer's disease and caregivers in our work.
Sam, I couldn't think of a better way to end this. So thank you to all of you for your time and engagement today. We all want to stay connected, particularly around the issues related to value assessment. You can find us at www.paveurope.com. Thank you to George, Drew, Megan, and the rest of the team for organizing a great 3 days. We hope everyone will enjoy the remaining sessions today. Goodbye and stay well. Back to you, George.